Establishing immediate flank pressure, this flank opening aims to influence the center from afar. Developing a knight to f6 signals an intent to control central squares and prepare for castling, keeping options open for white's next move. Developing the knight to f3 supports central control and prepares for kingside castling, offering flexibility in the upcoming English opening skirmish. Solidifying the center and preparing for king's side development, this move opens diagonals for the bishop and queen. Preparing for fianchetto, this advances the kingside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for the bishop later. Emboldened, black immediately contests the center, aiming to disrupt white's fianchetto and seize central space. Opening up the kingside diagonal for your bishop, this move prepares for castling and contests the central light squares. Asserting central presence, this pawn push immediately challenges white's queenside space and opens avenues for black's pieces. Prioritizing king's safety is paramount, allowing for the eventual deployment of other pieces to their optimal squares. This natural development solidifies black's central pawn presence and prepares to contest the d-file. Exchanging pawns here releases central tension, opening avenues for piece development and potential maneuvering on the d-file. Recapturing maintains central pawn presence, creating a balanced but potentially sharp encounter. Instantly claiming central space, white aims to dominate the board's heart. Establishing central influence, black counters white's pawn push by developing a bishop, aiming to control squares and prepare for further piece activity. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies central control, preparing for potential pawn pushes and harmonizing piece activity for white's queenside expansion. Solidifying central pawn presence, black prepares to castle and develop their kingside for safety. Developing the bishop solidifies the kingside and prepares to contest the central light squares. Sealing off the queenside pawns creates a complex, imbalanced structure where black must be wary of white's kingside attacking potential. Squeezing the queenside pawn, this knight maneuver aggressively claims more space and restricts black's counterplay. Instantly secures the king behind a pawn phalanx, a common defensive maneuver in closed English structures. A bold capture that opens up central lines, but potentially weakens white's kingside pawn structure. Sacrificing material to disrupt white's pawn structure is a bold, dynamic choice, aiming for active piece play over immediate equality. Seizing central space, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and launch an attack against the exposed queen. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight opens lines, challenging white's central control and seeking active piece play. Liberating the knight from its pawn shield, white aims to disrupt black's central control and exploit the isolated pawn. Sacrificing pawn control to free the bishop and prepare for aggressive queenside play. Securing the crucial semi-open queen's file, this piece simultaneously pressures black's d5 pawn, aiming to exploit its isolated status and restrict defensive options. The bishop's retreat sacrifices tempo, but aims to disrupt white's pawn chain by targeting the central d5 pawn. Liberating the queen's bishop, this exchange aims to destabilize black's pawn structure and open lines towards the king. Reclaiming material with the bishop solidifies black's center and prepares for a more active piece development, aiming to exploit white's somewhat exposed kingside. Carving out central space opens lines, but that bishop now has a target. Exploiting the open diagonal opens lines to the white king. Reclaiming the bishop immediately resolves the central tension, though it grants black significant influence over the light squares. Capturing the knight on d4 opens up diagonals for your bishop and aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn reopens the crucial rook file, demanding immediate attention to the white king's safety. Recapturing the pawn with the knight redirects pressure, aiming to untangle black's pieces and potentially attack white's e4 pawn. Unleashing the queen on the c-file directly challenges black's bishop and eyes the d4 pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Creating a more robust pawn structure by preparing f5 solidifies the kingside and addresses the nagging queenside weakness. Seizing the b7 pawn strips black's queenside of defenders and aims to exploit the exposed king. Challenging the rook's control of the vital c-file, this piece repositions for defense and potential counterplay. Retrieving the bishop to its former square opens up the diagonal for potential future attacks and shores up a key defensive point on the king side. Unleashing the queen from its pawn shield, this move simultaneously eyes the vulnerable king's flank and contests the open c-file, setting up potential tactical skirmishes. Strengthening the queenside pawn structure with b3 aims to consolidate after the tactical skirmishes, creating a more robust defensive setup. Pivoting the knight to d4 fortifies the center and prepares to seize the open c-file for immediate pressure. This maneuver seizes the initiative, challenging the queen and aiming to disrupt black's coordination. Relocating the rook to the open d-file asserts pressure and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Reinforcing the central control and preparing to contest the e-file, this move subtly pivots the game towards greater positional complexity. The knight repositions, eyeing the king's immediate vicinity and seeking a more active square. Seizing the open file with the rook creates immediate pressure and limits black's maneuverability. Probing the queenside weakness offers a dynamic counterplay, aiming to dislodge the rook from its potent outpost. Reclaiming the open file, white prepares to challenge black's queen and consolidate control. Targeting white's vulnerable king, this queen maneuver brilliantly opens a diagonal assault after forcing the rook back. Shifting the queen to an active square, now it eyes black's vulnerable back rank while also defending its own pawn. The queen's maneuver now confronts white's queen side, aiming to disrupt coordination before black's pieces can be further entangled. Shifting the king to safety from the unleashed rook's influence proves prudent. This pawn push, while seemingly harmless, begins to shore up black's queenside and prepare for future pawn advances along the b-file, contesting white's initiative. Targeting the vulnerable d-file, this bishop aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit weaknesses. A daring check, leveraging the open file to create immediate complications for white's king. Liberating the queen to actively pressure the kingside, though it risks isolating the bishop for now. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for potential pawn advances, this repositions the queen to a more active, defensive posture. Unlocking the queen's pressure, this maneuver reestablishes an imposing presence on the kingside, creating new tactical possibilities. A bold attempt to disrupt white's queenside initiative by rerouting the rook through the open file. Shifting the rook to the second rank initiates a subtle repositioning, potentially preparing for an infiltration or offering defensive reinforcement depending on black's response. Unblocking the queen's diagonal, this knight suddenly becomes a powerful outpost and a critical attacking piece. Reinforcing the central e-file structure aims to restrict black's knight mobility and prepare for a potential kingside advance. A fascinating attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure, though it surrenders precious tempo and invites further pressure on the kingside. Realigning the rooks opens a path for potential piece play, aiming to dislodge the knight. This knight's return to d4, a familiar square, signifies a calculated retreat, aiming to consolidate forces and regroup after a series of exchanges. Re-establishing the rook's active presence on the second rank prepares for future central pawn advances or potential flank attacks. Challenging white's king directly with an unexpected tempo, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed monarch and potentially force exchanges. Relocating the queen here aims to preserve the initiative and prepare for potential attacks on the kingside, while also defending the e4 pawn. Unleashing a sharp queen maneuver, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain tactical initiative, probing for weaknesses. Probing for weaknesses, f4 aims to destabilize black's pawn structure and open attacking avenues towards the king. Seeking refuge for the black queen, but this retreat offers little counterplay and allows white to consolidate further. Securing the kingside, This piece aims to disrupt black's queenside pressure and potentially forge a path for your monarch. Contesting the queenside with the queen allows for potential counterplay along the open files. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, seeking to pry open lines against the black monarch. The knight's return to the center offers crucial defense and a chance to reposition for future queenside counterplay. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, this aggressive advance sacrifices material for initiative and aims to rip open black's defenses. A desperate attempt to reignite activity and exploit the exposed king, though white's defense appears solid. Shifting queen pressure aims to exploit the exposed black king and control central squares. A daring infiltration aiming to disrupt white's pieces and potentially create mating threats against the exposed king. Shifting the queen to defend the rook creates a more solid defensive structure, preparing to contest the d-file. Sacrificing the queen here to try and disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines towards the king could be a desperate attempt. Trading queens initiates a likely endgame, and white's king feels exposed on its current square. Reviving a knight to f4 offers a critical outpost, disrupting white's pawn structure and creating immediate threats against the weakened king. Opening the f-file now creates immediate attacking chances against black's exposed king. Unleashing the rook's power along the open g-file, aiming for a swift mate. Seeking to exploit white's advanced pawn structure, this advance aims to open lines and potentially trap black's knight. Acknowledging the open king, black aims to fortify his monarch and prepare for a potential pawn push. Initiating a mating attack by aiming for the vulnerable king on the g-file, potentially leveraging the rook's repositioning. Trading rooks here opens up a clear path for the knight to become an active defender of the king. The king abandons its fortress, stepping into the fray to confront the remaining opposition. Sacrificing the pawn here creates an imbalance, potentially opening lines towards the exposed white king. Unleashing a pawn chain breaks open lines for your rook and threatens the stranded knight, aiming for decisive attack. Opening the kingside with this capture creates a dynamic battleground, potentially unleashing white's remaining material. The bishop finds a new outpost, aiming to restrict black's pawn advances. The black king, now exposed in the center, must carefully navigate the open files and avoid becoming a target for white's remaining pieces. Aims to control the crucial central files, aiming to restrict black's limited pieces and force a breakthrough. Exploring the open files might offer a sliver of hope, though the king's exposed nature is a severe liability. Sacrificing the rook opens a devastating kingside attack and exploits the exposed black monarch. Embracing the discovered check leads to a critical pawn exchange, but opens the door for white's remaining pieces to target the now exposed monarch. Activating the rook along the open file to disrupt black's pawn structure and threaten the vulnerable king. Restoring the rook to the 7th rank now offers improved pressure against white's king. Activating the king offers a glimmer of hope in this dire situation, seeking active squares before complete capitulation. Repositioning the rook to a more active file, aiming to challenge white's recent pawn advances. Unlocking the king's shelter, seeking activity and potential breakthroughs in the center. Repositioning the knight to target the weak f4 pawn introduces new tactical possibilities. Activating the bishop towards black's weakened kingside pawns offers significant attacking potential. King exposed, a desperate sacrifice to disrupt the advancing pawns and gain breathing room before it's too late. Protecting your king's perimeter while maintaining central pressure is the immediate priority. Repositioning the knight to g4 prepares a kingside pawn storm and potentially supports a knight sacrifice. Aggressively pursuing black's exposed monarch, the rook reclaims vital space and prepares for further penetration. Relocating the king to the edge seems precarious, potentially inviting further pressure along the open rank. Activating the bishop here aims to finally unburden the king and create some attacking potential. A strategic retreat to consolidate forces, aiming to regroup and prepare a counterattack. reinforcing the knight's outpost, though the king's exposed flank invites further attack.